Speaking of the Uyghur genocide, I'm going to have a guest on in a week, Arsalan Hidayat. This is a guy that I'm sure you know if you see his profile. Max posts about him a little bit. He accuses him of working for the CIA.
Well, what is his? Is he with a group that's funded by the NED?
I believe so, but this is him. But I'm bringing him on. We've been talking about having a discussion for a while, but he's going to come talk about the Uyghur genocide. And obviously, as a Muslim, I'm sympathetic to the plight of all Muslims around the world. At the same time, though, I don't know that it's a genocide. So talking to people like you, I'm going to talk to him. He's going to tell me, what's going on. I've talked to Jackson Hinkle about it briefly, but Jackson Hinkle, I wouldn't really say is an expert on the topic.
Either am I, but I
yeah.
know what a genocide is.
Yeah.
Genocide is not a term you throw around lightly.
Right, especially after the last year in Gaza.
Exactly. That's a genocide. The Nazi Holocaust, that's a genocide. In the case of China and Xinjiang, there's repression. I mean, that's what I can see from afar. There's repression. There's been a crackdown. But the crackdown happens after you have a number of terrorist attacks by separatists in Xinjiang. And China cracked down by establishing these camps and vocational centers where basically, unless you go to these trainings, you're going to get jailed. That's a harsh crackdown, and there's repression involved. But to call it a genocide, to me, is insane. It's an insult to people who actually suffer from a genocide. And look just how quickly Mike Pompeo and Antony Blinken labeled this one a genocide, but not Gaza. I mean, how can you even compare the two? Even before the genocide in Gaza began, the treatment of Palestinians in Gaza, I think, was far worse than Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Xinjiang people had the freedom to leave. They weren't living under a murderous blockade in which the occupying Israeli army controls what comes in and out, including food and medicine. So I don't understand how people can still cling to this genocide claim, especially when the sources for it are groups that are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a notorious CIA front. They fund programs that destabilize targeted governments, and it's obvious what the aim is for. They want to use this issue, just as the CIA does this everywhere. They find a wedge issue in a country that can destabilize it. And in the case of Xinjiang, you have repression. And look, just compare the two responses. The U.S. suffered a terrorist attack on 9/11. What was the response?
They launched like half the
exactly.
Middle East.
Yeah. Xinjiang suffered a number of terrorist attacks. What was their response? It was to have a crackdown on the Uyghurs. And of course, I oppose repression, and there's plenty to criticize there. But to call it a genocide, to me, is just so ridiculous, especially when the sources for it are Antony Blinken, Mike Pompeo, and far-right Christian bigot Adrian Zenz.
So based on what you know, is it every Uyghur in Xinjiang that is required to go to these camps? Or is it a certain kind of person, like someone who is sympathetic based on intelligence towards armed separatist groups? Or is it every single Uyghur citizen?
From what I understood, it was mostly targeted at males. And certainly in a sweeping program like this, you're going to have innocent people, mostly innocent people, caught up in it. And it's a form of repression. And I'm fine to oppose it and criticize it. I'm just not going to call it a genocide.
These camps, do they still exist? And if so, what happens in them, these vocational camps?
From my understanding, there's like what China calls de-radicalization training and also training in jobs. And I'm sure there's some propagandizing going on where people are basically being, pressured, psychologically pressured. And maybe there's even physical abuse for all I know. All I know is I don't trust Mike Pompeo and Antony Blinken and the sources they fund as impartial. I'm certainly not going to take their claims on faith.
I have a relative who recently moved to China. He lives in Chongqing, I think is like the 4th largest city. And I was surprised. He told me like there are mosques, I fast here, I pray here. And then I found out from other friends that there are a lot of Muslims living in China and Islam is openly practiced in China.
Yeah.
And that's surprising, I think, for me and many other people when they hear it, because they think with the Uyghur genocide that Islam is just hated. But what I've come to understand is that China doesn't really have a problem with Islam, but they do have a problem with an independence movement that is seeking to break away from China.
Sure.
Now, whether or not they have the right to do so, that's up to them to decide. If they want to do it, fine. But I think people have the idea that China is just murdering Muslims because they're communists, and communists hate all religion.
Yes.
And I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, and again, when the source of this comes from Mike Pompeo and Antony Blinken, two people committed with all their soul to killing Muslims, especially in Gaza, how can we take that allegation on faith? It requires evidence, and that's the problem. Every time someone looks at the evidence, says my colleagues at the Gray Zone have done, the source comes back to people like Adrian Zenz, who's a fabulous Christian bigot. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to take his word. And I'm unfortunately, outlets like Democracy Now! Have had him on as an expert, and we're being duped. And for obvious reasons, is because China is a geopolitical adversary. And of course, there's repression like there is everywhere. But that's what the U.S. does when it wants to weaken an adversary, is they pick an issue that can divide a country and they exploit it. And that's why there's all this money invested in Uyghur groups by the National Endowment for Democracy. It's so obvious. The CIA and the NED are not spending money supporting Palestinian civil society because they don't care about Palestinians. They don't care about the Muslims there. I hope people can see that now. And yeah, we're not hearing as much anymore about the camps in China because there was an article in the Associated Press not too long ago saying that the camps are no more. And I've never been to China. I don't know very much about China. I'm happy I don't live under the Chinese government, to be honest with you. We have a lot of freedom here, which I really appreciate. And I wouldn't want to live under the Chinese system. But it's not my place to tell China how they should govern. Because I live in the West, so it's not my business, and certainly not the business of our governments to fund groups in the hopes of dividing a country and supporting independence movements, because that serves our geopolitical goals.
Yeah, I'm going to have Arsalan on and hear more from him. I'm still learning about it. I think the history, prior to the beginning of the 20th century, the area was known to the indigenous as Turkestan. But then they came under the fold of the Chinese government. I don't know if it was through conquest or I'm sure probably through military power. I have to do more research. But yeah, my understanding is that the people still would like to see an independent state, and they see themselves Central Asian, Turkic.
And that's their right. That's perfectly their right. They have every right to fight for that.
Yeah.
Not our right, though, to come in and meddle and
instigate
for the goal of undermining a geopolitical rival.